As a scandal is revealed, the executive director of the San Diego Association of Governments says he's stepping down. Has SANDAG been playing fast and loose with the truth? And a former San Diego mayor crafts a sweetheart deal with the county to build subsidized housing. I'm Kenny Goldberg, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of this week's top stories. I'm Kenny Goldberg, sitting in for Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are reporter Andy Keats from Voice of San Diego. Hi, Andy.
How you doing, Kenny?
Andrew Bowen, Metro reporter from KPBS News. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, Kenny.
James DeHaven, watchdog and data reporter for the San Diego Union Tribune. Hi, James.
Hi, Kenny.
And freelance journalist Kelly Davis. Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
The bad news just keeps on coming for San Diego's regional planning agency known as SANDAG. We've learned that SANDAG knew 13 years ago that revenue from the 2004 Transnet sales tax extension would fall billions short, but they didn't tell the voters. And now we find out that the agency took steps to keep the public in the dark about what transportation projects would really cost. What's more, SANDAG's longtime executive director says he's retiring at the end of the year. Andy Keats, you broke the story in October. What prompted you to look into this in the first place?
So, leading up to that vote, there was a great deal of discussion. Really, the dominating discussion was how to slice up the pie of revenue that would come in from SANDAG's new tax measure, and whether you would do 50% of it for highways and 50% for transit or some other breakdown therein. And somewhere along the line, I just got the idea and said, well, why don't I take a look at how big that pie actually is? So I requested that data. And what I got back was a relatively limited spreadsheet in terms of what went into that calculation. And I just started making charts based on what was in it. And one of them was this variable taxable retail sales, all of the things that would be sold in the county that would be subject to the sales tax. And it just so happened that that variable included all of the relevant information that you would need to figure out that something was amiss, because it just showed hockey stick growth forever, long into the future, to the point that it would shortly double what had ever happened, adjusted for inflation, in the history of San Diego County. At that point, it didn't really take an economist to start asking questions about how reliable these numbers were.
And what did SANDAG say when you confronted them with this information?
Well, we went back and forth for a little while. They initially said, well, we're going to need to look into it a little bit more. I had some disputed, some pretty heated arguments with people over there about just how reasonable these assumptions were. I had plenty of outside experts who were telling me that they weren't at all reasonable. And now we've come to learn that what I didn't know was going on at that time was behind the scenes a pretty feverish search for just how this mistake had happened and what they should do about it, including right up into legal counsel and SANDAG staff directing lower-level staffers to hide and even delete certain documents that involved their search for just what was causing this errant number.
Now let's go to last year's election. There was something up with Measure A that didn't quite feel kosher to you. What did you find out?
So, and all of that informs the fact that when Measure A was on the ballot promising $18 billion in revenue, if your taxable retail sales number is out of whack, obviously the overall revenue that you're going to be able to bring in is out of whack. And so I basically looked into that, and long and the short of it in the end is that it was not going to bring in $18 billion, which they've now conceded. It's going to bring it would have brought in far closer to $14 or $15 billion. And at the same time, and these two things are very closely linked. Tax revenue in the county is tax revenue in the county, whether it was on a ballot measure approved in 2004 or one that was on the ballot in 2016. So quickly, I jumped over to look at Transnet, the existing sales tax measure, and it turns out that, yes, that is also running far short of expectations. It was promised on the ballot to be $14 billion. It's going to end up being closer to $9 billion.
Now, Andrew, let's bring you into this. Investigators recently looking into all these accounting errors and supposed malfeasance on SANDAG's part. What did they conclude?
Well, so a law firm out of Orange County in Los Angeles was hired to do an investigation in all of this, all thanks to Andy. And so what they found was that a couple of things. The first focus of the investigation was on the forecasts themselves, what went wrong with them, and why were they not corrected. They found that basically the staff turnover had created this loss in expertise over many, many years, and it got to the point in 2015, 2016 that the only person at SANDAG who really understood these models that created these inflated numbers was the former chief economist, Marnie Cox. Now, the SANDAG brought in some other people to kind of help figure out, revise that because he was planning for retirement, I guess, and they had raised some questions, but they were kind of shot down. They were kind of trying to blow the whistle, but the SANDAG executives had invested so much trust in this former chief economist that they were not able to, those concerns didn't rise to the level of the board of directors and then the voting public.
Is that to say they blamed everything on this former economist?
Andy, I mean, kind of. A lot of it has been placed on this former economist who's no longer working for SANDAG, so, it's pretty easy for them to kind of shift the blame off to somebody who doesn't work there and isn't really a public figure anymore. The other part of the investigation was probably the worst part, which is SANDAG's response to this whole thing becoming public by Voice of San Diego. So they found that shortly after a public records request was submitted, that the chief legal counsel had conveniently chosen that day to remind everyone and staff to delete draft documents before they turn 60 days old, at which point they become easier for journalists and members of the public to get their hands on. They also created this unsearchable folder on a folder that was not searchable by the legal department, which is responsible for responding to public records requests. So there was this, what the investigators called appearance of a cover-up that really shows a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability.
All right. Now, Andy, whose fault is this? I take it they didn't blame that on the former economist.
No, they didn't. And in fact, there's kind of contradictory messages about who specifically in that meeting delivered that directive. It seems to have been the chief legal counsel, but there's kind of some dissent about exactly who said what. What was specifically said by the investigator, though, is that reminders about the agency's retention policy were not at all common. They weren't regular. This wasn't something that happened in monthly meetings all the time. In fact, it happened so rarely that some of the people told investigators that they felt that they were receiving a coded message that they should delete records. And some of them said that they did, that records were in fact deleted. Now, the investigators didn't find any forensic evidence that things definitely were deleted, but witnesses told them, yeah, we think things were deleted. That seemed to be the message we received.
Well, let me ask you guys, how important is SANDAG in San Diego? We're talking about this agency, and some people may not even know what they do. How important is it?
It's incredibly important. It decides where our tax dollars are spent on transportation infrastructure, what kind of projects our tax dollars are spent on, highways versus roads versus bike lanes versus public transit. So this has a huge impact on the region's air quality, on the region's greenhouse gas emissions, on our quality of life and how we get around. So it's an incredibly powerful agency and one that at this point has lost an extreme amount of credibility with the voters. I mean, Andy and I were talking on Twitter a while ago about the fact that, if they were ever to try to field another tax increase, it would be simply too easy to just shut it down. Any funded opposition could easily send out a mailer saying, SANDAG really expects us to believe that these numbers are right, and it's been caught lying before. Why isn't it? SANDAG could have the most rock-solid analysis itself and vetted by the public and vetted by experts, and it still probably wouldn't have the credibility to get that two-thirds majority necessary from the voters to raise taxes.
All right, Andy. Now, we hear that Gary Gallegos, a longtime executive director of SANDAG, says he'll step down by the end of the year. What's the relationship between his announcement and this whole scandal that you've uncovered?
Well, they've taken pains to call it a retirement, even a planned retirement. It happened just days after this investigation finally came out, and even shorter from that, from when the board voted to review his performance and his employment in the first place. So, I don't know. I think it would be a real leap to suggest that it wasn't in some cases related. We should add, though, that it's not at all clear what his announcement means for the board's own decision-making. The board had said, we want to bring you in to review your employment and determine how that moves forward. I think they're still going to want to do that. That was going to happen at a closed session in the future. So now we know that he intends to leave sometime between now and December, but when that happens and under what terms and conditions, I think is still up in the air. The board also said that they wanted to bring in some other SANDAG staffers to ask them questions. It's not at all clear what exactly they mean by that, or what they would hope to learn, or what actions they would hope to take from that. So that's still up in the air. They also discussed kind of launching additional investigations. There was specific matters that weren't within the scope of work of this investigation that I had also reported over the last year, that the investigators said other witnesses raised as substantial issues and that should be considered for more, a closer look. And some board members have expressed interest in that. They also suggested that maybe they want to take a look at a forensic look at whether, in fact, certain documents were deleted and why. So there really is quite a bit still up in the air after this, even though Gary Gallegos has made this announcement.
All right, now let's get to a bill that Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher has introduced in the Assembly. What's that all about, Andrew? Explain that.
Yeah, it's called AB 805. It would make big changes to SANDAG as well as to MTS and NCTD, the two transit operators in the county. The non-controversial changes to SANDAG are that it would create an independent performance auditor to review how SANDAG is doing its job, how good a job it's doing. Everyone seems to support that. It would also give MTS and NCTD the ability to ask voters for tax increases, which could potentially create another avenue, as we were just talking about now, for an increase in revenue for transportation funding without going through SANDAG, which has this big stain on its reputation. The most controversial aspects of this bill are some concessions to labor unions, allowing much more favorable terms to unions when SANDAG signs construction projects, which a lot of Republicans and conservatives don't like, and also changes to the voting structure of the board of directors. So currently there are some winners and losers in the current structure. Basically, without getting too much into the weeds because we don't have a ton of time, the current structure gives a little bit more favor to smaller cities because they have one representative on every city in the county has a representative on the board, regardless of how small their population is, and they have one vote, just like the city of San Diego has one vote when those votes are counted as a tally. There's a weighted vote that is based on population size, and AB 805 would give more sway to that weighted vote. Basically, the effect would be the representatives of San Diego and Chula Vista, the two biggest cities in the county, would have more power to make decisions over where we spend our money.
All right, but what does this have to do with what you've uncovered in terms of the malfeasance and the faking the documents, deleting documents? What does this have to do with that?
Well, so the only provision that is directly related to any of this would be the creation of an independent auditor. And I think last week, Lori Zaff, the Republican city councilwoman for the city of San Diego, kind of said something along these lines, which was, look, unless there's some evidence that the city of San Diego and the city of Chula Vista were especially hot on the question of these forecasting numbers, there's no indication that this change in the governance structure would have prevented what took place. Likewise, there's no evidence that the construction of labor contracts would have prevented this from taking place. I think it's fair to say that the relationship to the scandal on those provisions is a political one. That there was blood in the water, there was an opportunity, and they seized on that opportunity.
And labor unions and environmental groups have had problems with how SANDAG does business for a very long time. This bill is about far more than just transparency and accountability. It's also about greenhouse gas emissions. It's about spending money in economically disadvantaged communities. It's about proportional representation, giving people who live in San Diego and Chula Vista, a more equal seat at the table to people who live in Del Mar and Santee. So it's certainly a lot more. The scope of this is much farther beyond the scandal that has faced SANDAG in the past year.
Wow, that's really something. Well, I'm sure we'll revisit this as we move along. Affordable housing is in short supply in San Diego. The county is pledging to do what it can with a $25 million program. Part of the funding will be used to build 50 low-income housing units for seniors on some county-owned land in Linda Vista. The county awarded that project to San Diego Kind Corporation, founded by the sister of former San Diego Mayor Maureen O'Connor. Now, it turns out that Kind Corporation hasn't built any affordable housing units since 1989, yet it got the job without going through a competitive bid process. James, how did this deal come about in the first place?
Well, it came about because apparently the sisters O'Connor, Mavernine and Maureen, found out that Ron Roberts was going to have some money available in his neighborhood reinvestment program funds to sponsor a study of feasibility for building ultra-low-cost affordable housing in Linda Vista. They, or rather Maureen, set up a meeting with Ron Roberts, had Mavernine be there, even though she's no longer involved with Kind Corporation or her sister. And it went from there. They had 3 other meetings, and the contract was awarded in June to Kind Corp.
Kelly, what do you make of the fact that they didn't go through any kind of competitive bidding process?
Well, I mean, clearly it's a relationship here. Ron Roberts was on the city council when Maureen O'Connor was mayor. Both of the sisters have been involved in San Diego politics for a long time. So it seems like, yeah, definitely, them knowing Ron Roberts, they, got their foot in the door that way.
Now, I understand Kind Corporation says it can build these units for about $100,000 a piece. Mm-hmm. Now, that's below what other companies say they can do it for. James, can you explain what the discrepancy there?
Well, it's about a third of the average cost for other affordable housing developers around the county. I can't necessarily explain the discrepancy entirely. I haven't seen any design documents from Kind Corp or any renderings or anything. I understand none have been produced. I'm told by Supervisor Roberts that these are going to be wood frame, 250 square foot freestanding units. I've never heard of anyone getting close to doing $100,000 per unit using wood. I mean, generally you hear about shipping containers or some such under those circumstances. So it's hard to answer that.
Tiny houses.
Tiny houses, sure.
I mean, 250 square feet, that's not exactly the Taj Mahal right
No,
there.
that's
Right.
very, very small.
And these are supposed to be for low-income senior citizens.
Yeah.
So does the county not have a policy in place that requires some sort of competitive bid process when these things come up?
I'm not sure that they do for the neighborhood reinvestment program funds. I don't know. I don't know the full history of that program. But it's my understanding that it's kind of just you're allowed to give it to who you want to give it to, and it's somewhat discretionary.
Now, what kind of experience, Kelly, does Kind Corporation have in building low-income housing?
Mavernine O'Connor, Maureen's twin sister, started Kind Corporation in the early 70s, and at that time built, through a HUD loan, built low-income senior housing. It was at 9th and Broadway. It's called San Diego Square, about 156 units. And then in the 80s and 90s, acquired 2 residential hotels and rehabbed those. But after about 1988, did nothing. We can find no evidence of them doing anything more than running these buildings. And actually, to do that, they hired management companies to run the buildings. And what we found also is that with San Diego Square, the biggest building, they have a very poor track record of how they treat their clients, or how they treat their tenants. There were issues with, they wouldn't allow tenants to use this parking space that was attached to the building. The parking lot sat mostly empty, and these poor senior citizens had to go park blocks away. I talked to one woman who had been mugged because she had to park her car back, in East Village and walk to San Diego Square. There were bug infestations. They kicked out the service provider who was providing the seniors with recreation activities and legal support and health services. They ousted that provider. They kept the seniors out of a multi-purpose room where they would, hope to go gather for like holiday meals. So there were a lot of issues with how Kind Corporation was not very kind to the tenants of San Diego Square.
Well, James, that strikes me as quite a shoddy track record, and yet they got this deal to build some new houses. What do you make of that?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I could speculate as to why that happened, or even, I can't even say for sure the extent to which Kind Corp was vetted by Supervisor Roberts. I asked him about that. I never heard back as to whether he had concerns about, that their past issues with tenants.
How big a deal is this, Kelly, in terms of all the things going on in San Diego, this particular incident, this particular thing with Kind Corporation? How big a deal is it?
I mean, low-income housing is desperately needed, and there are a lot of great low-income housing providers in San Diego County. So it was very bizarre that none of them were approached to submit proposals, that it was just Ron Roberts picked this particular nonprofit that does not have a good track record.
Yeah, and additionally, the issue of how expensive it is to produce a single affordable housing unit is not some obscure concern. This has been a major discussion point in the city for a very long time. If some nonprofit has a super secret way to provide them at a third of the cost, it would really be great for them to reveal that to the whole county, and we could start maybe utilizing it to deal with this issue.
James and I were thinking, well, maybe they've got some expert on their board of directors who knows something, no, they don't have any housing experts on their board of directors.
It's like Nixon's plan for Vietnam. It's just like we can't tell you, because then
So now that your story is written, have you still not got any response from the Roberts office, or have you heard anything, any blowback or any response to this story?
Yeah, we've gotten some response from people in the community, not a lot of on-the-record discussions so far, but I'd say that it's been a positive reaction and a surprised reaction because this company is a very small nonprofit, and yes, they've been around for 40 years, but they do not have a lot of recent experience. So I think people were surprised.
And their financial disclosures are just bizarre. James dug into those. We looked at how much money Maverick O'Connor has been paid. There's these series of related nonprofits, and between 2001 and 2015, she was paid $4.5 million. We were talking beforehand. There's the most recent disclosure. She was paid more than SANDAG's Gary Gallegos, who what's SANDAG's
$300,000.
Yeah, but what's SANDAG's operating budget like?
Yeah, right.
Right,
quite a bit larger.
So yeah, she was paid like what, $450,000.
Yeah.
So and again, we don't know what they're doing.
Well, let's try to bring everything together here. We're talking about SANDAG and their supposed malfeasances, what have you, and then we have this thing that didn't get a competitive bid. We don't know what's going on there. How pervasive are these kind of business practices in San Diego, to your guys' experience, in terms of government, in terms of other entities?
I mean, I don't want to cast too broad an aspersion. What I would say is, in general, in government, almost every deal is probably pretty clean, but that still leaves room for a significant number of issues, even if it's a severe minority spread across the entire workspace of government, that can still add up to quite a bit of issues.
But what about transparency? That's one of the issues here. I mean, Kelly, in your reporting experience, is this kind of thing, this lack of transparency, is that a common thing that you encounter?
Like Andy said, I think most agencies, most government officials, they do try to be transparent, but there's just this handful that kind of fly under the radar or think that no one's going to catch them. And I was thinking back to the city of San Diego's pension crisis, and when somebody's, they finally discovered those emails like, eek, and oh my God, and it's like people just don't learn that at some point you're going to get caught, so it might be just a few, but it seems that they do get caught, and the repercussions are huge. It just kind of poisons everything else.
And just to kind of put all this in perspective, the people who really end up suffering from bad deals are not the officials at the top.
Right.
They're the citizens and the residents of San Diego.
Yeah.
So lastly, folks, who cares about this kind of thing other than reporters, other than us? And I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but go ahead, James, weigh in on that.
I would hope that anyone who cares about being able to live in San Diego County would care about things such as this, because as Andy pointed out, when you come up with a good idea for affordable housing, you ought to be able to share it, and other people ought to be able to pick up on it. If you don't have such an idea, maybe you ought to get paid for it,
Yeah, I mean, look, set aside the intricacies and the details of the SANDAG issue or this affordable housing deal, the end result of both of these is something that affects a lot of people. How long does it take you to get to work? How far away from work do you have to live to be able to afford your housing? Those are pretty practical concerns, and I think sometimes we report out the details of those things and see how things went wrong, but ultimately that's the stuff that people care about.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. That wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I want to thank very much Andy Keats, Andrew Bowen, James DeHaven, and Kelly Davis for joining me. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kenny Goldberg. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.